So let me welcome you all to the second Max Weber program book roundtable this academic year. I think you all know me, but my name is Dorothee Bohle. I'm the director of the Max Weber program. This book roundtable series is new this academic year, and the criteria for choosing a book, it should be an important recent book in the social sciences that tackles a major topic of our time and appeals to a broad and multidisciplinary audience. And I, of course, am happy to say that Vivian Schmidt's book, which we will be discussing today, Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone, certainly meets all of these criteria. The Eurozone crisis was, as we all, I guess, remember, a defining moment in the recent history of the EU, and it sometimes risked tearing the EU apart. We had heightened debtor-creditor conflicts that translated into moralizing nationalist conflicts between the so-called frugal North and the so-called prodigal South, and the way how the crisis was addressed by European institutions and politicians proved to be, I think, economically, at least initially, economically wrong and politically very divisive. So Vivian Schmidt's book exposes the deep crisis of legitimacy that has resulted from this and traces the ways how EU actors have reacted to the crisis and how they sought to uphold legitimacy. Now, let me briefly introduce our guest, although my feeling is, Vivian has been at the EUY so often that you don't need an introduction, but there's always new people at the EUY, so and anyway, it's an honor to have you here, so I introduce you. So Vivian Schmidt is a Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and a Professor of International Relations at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies. And she's also a Professor of Political Science at Boston University, as well as a founding director of Boston University's Center for the Study of Europe. She's also a visiting professor at Luis Guido Cali University in Rome and also at the Copenhagen Business School. And her research focuses on European political economy, institutions, democracy, and political theory, and in particular on the importance of ideas and discourse in political analysis. She has widely published on these issues and has also not only written numerous journal articles, but also a number of books. So the most recent ones are, I think the most recent one, apart from the one that we will be discussing today, is actually Governance and Politics in the Post-Crisis EU, which is a textbook, which she edited with Ramona Coman and Amadine Crespi in 2020. But then we also have a book from 2013, Resilient Liberalism in Europe's Political Economy, co-edited with Mark Thatcher, and a book in 2011, Debating Political Identity and Legitimacy in the European Union, which is co-edited with Sina Lucarelli and Furio Cerruti. And as you can see from these titles, they all resolve around issues of political economy, issues of legitimacy, and the European Union and governance. So I'm very pleased to have you here and that we will be discussing your new book, Vivian. Let me also present the members of the panel now in alphabetical order. We have Paul Dermine, who is a Max Weber Fellow at the Law Department and who works on the new economic governance of the Eurozone. Sebastian Diessner is a Max Weber Fellow at the Roman Schubert Center, and he works on the politics of macroeconomic policy, the political economy of central banking, among other things. Brigid Laffan is the director of the Robert Schuman Center, working on all issues of European integration, socio-economic governance, and of course, most recently, a lot on the effects of Brexit. So welcome everybody, and thank you everyone for accepting to do this. Just let me briefly remind everyone of the format. So Vivian, you have 10 minutes to basically remind us of major points of your book. Then each respondent has also up to 10 minutes. And then Vivian, you have again some, you can have a short reminder to react to the comments, and then we can open it to the public. And the whole event, because we are all zoomed out, should not be longer than 1 hour, maximum 1.5 hours. So with this introduction, I give the floor to Vivian, and once again, welcome and thank you very much for accepting this. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So thank you, Doro, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Paul, Sebastian, and Brigid for serving as discussants. So let me tell you a bit about my book. As the title suggests, the book focuses on questions of legitimacy related to the Eurozone crisis. And here I'm using legitimacy as the lens through which to examine political economy, politics, and governance in the Eurozone crisis. My analytic framework is discursive institutionalism, i.e. the importance of looking at not just the substantive content of ideas, but the interactive processes of discourse in institutional context. And this analytic framework serves as a bridge to the study of the substantive areas of normative as well as empirical concern, such as democracy, but also the normative legitimation of democratic governance. The book is, of course, actually focused on more than just the Eurozone crisis. It addresses the nature of legitimacy in the European Union more generally, while offering tools for analysis, I hope, that apply equally to other crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic that we're currently living through. So just to focus in now on the Eurozone crisis, it's not just about economics, it's also about politics and democracy. So a brief encapsulation, governing by rules and ruling by numbers at the inception of the Eurozone crisis put democratic legitimacy at risk. And we know this not only simply from problems with the rules themselves and the governance, but we also see it in terms of deteriorating economics and increasingly toxic politics. Importantly, EU actors themselves recognize that, and within a couple of years, you saw the reinterpretation of the rules and the numbers by stealth, by not admitting it, which was also a problem of legitimacy. At least we saw incremental improvements, but those were still suboptimal rules and perceptions of illegitimacy. So before going any further, I do need to define legitimacy, and I define it in two ways. The first is kind of the obvious, the normal way about legitimacy in terms of governing authority. It's a Weberian notion, and it's based in public consent and public trust in governing bodies to give them authority. But another aspect of legitimacy, and the aspect that I'm focusing on here, is legitimacy in terms of governing activity, which of course has a direct effect on governing authority, because if there are problems in the governing authority that can undermine, in governing activities that can undermine governing authority. And when I talk about legitimacy in terms of governing activity, I'm building on EU studies systems theories. I'm using that language, although I'm not developing a very deep systematic or systemic analysis. But the EU study systems theory is based on Easton vaguely, as it's been updated over the years, in particular by Fritz Scharpf. And I try to take it one step farther. So there are three ways of considering governing activity. The first two are the ones that everyone is familiar with. It's output legitimacy in terms of policy effectiveness and performance, or it's input legitimacy in terms of citizen representation and participation, plus governing elites' political responsiveness. And here, there's often an assumption that there's a trade-off. People didn't vote for a policy, but it works, or the policy, people voted for it, it's stupid, doesn't work, but in both cases, it's legitimate. The next and legitimizing mechanism is throughput legitimacy, which is procedural quality of governance. And here, what I've done is group together a range of criteria that are often dealt with separately. This is efficacy, which is a technical standard, but then the normative standards are accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, and openness. And these are all very important to pull together, because then we can ask questions about how does procedural legitimacy interact with performance legitimacy and political legitimacy. And here, importantly, whereas there may be, and I emphasize the may be trade-offs between input and output legitimacy, I don't see the same, not at all the same kind of trade-off with throughput legitimacy. It's invisible if it's of good quality. Input just goes straight through to output. But if it's of poor quality, if the procedures are seen as incompetent, biased, corrupt, oppressive, this skews the politics and taints the policy results. So before we go on, as for legitimacy in the EU, the question is the EU itself democratically legitimate? As a governing authority, I argue in the book, yes, as it's been established slowly over time in policy area after policy area, as member states agree to the EU deepening integration and citizens tacitly accept it. But is the EU a democracy? Democratic legitimacy is a democracy? Well, can't call the EU a democracy, but its member states are democratically legitimate, and the EU in many ways is its member states. So what we have to do is end up seeing the EU as a kind of split level democracy, or at least have split level legitimacy, where performance and procedural legitimacy is focused at the EU level, political legitimacy at the national. And as such, and this is the sort of the problem for the EU, that indeed by its very existence, even as the EU may improve output effectiveness and policy performance, it tends to undermine member state democracy and political legitimacy as more and more policies are taken up to the EU level. But okay, what about EU legitimacy then in terms of governing activity? We could say, generally speaking, over the years, that EU governing activities have actually reinforced EU governing authority. They've been fine, except more recently with the EU's failure to solve its many crises, but in particular the Eurozone crisis, where I see a crisis of legitimacy, which is the book is all about that. So in the book, I explore all three legitimizing mechanisms, and here for now a repeat of what the book is all about, but now using the terms of legitimacy, a stylized view of the interactions of these three legitimizing mechanisms in the Eurozone crisis is EU leaders assumed that all they needed to do was double down on the rules, i.e. procedural legitimacy, and they would get good performance as an output, and so they didn't need to ask the people. But when economic performance deteriorates and politics becomes increasingly problematic, we see a reinterpretation of the rules, beginning 2012, 2013, really. But they do so by stealth without admitting it, and as a result, they have problems of accountability and transparency. And if to sort of encapsulate this with the sort of not admitting to what the changes are, the result was further problems of legitimacy as Southern Europeans felt oppressed even when they were accommodated, while Northern Europeans felt deceived regardless. Finally, 2015, when the EU leaders admit their flexibility, the damage was already done in terms of public perceptions, as well as relations amongst EU actors. So now, very, very quickly, just to say, how do I work this through in terms of the Eurozone crisis? I talk about Janus-based perceptions of EU actors. I mean, what I was confronted with the problem when you talk about legitimacy, you can't say, no, you're bad, you're good. This is about legitimacy, and it means I needed to talk about reasoned arguments. And I decided the best way to do this was to sort of have a Janus-based view, where on the one hand, you could say, here are the arguments suggesting all of the problems. Here are the arguments suggesting, well, maybe there is legitimacy. There's not, there is. So for the council, I asked, is this a dictatorship led by Germany as creditor states impose on weaker debtor states? Or was it instead a mutually accountable deliberative body? After all, everyone went along with these austerity rules and structural reforms. And also with the reinterpretation of the rules. And you go from stability in 2010 to growth and stability in 2012 to flexibility within the stability rules in 2014, and then investment by 2015, which did not go along with Germany's preferences at any particular point in time. So it seems to me that when we can sort of weigh these and say that whether this was a dictatorship or a deliberative body is open to question and further investigation for normal countries. But what about the program countries under the Troika? Here, I don't give you any legitimizing alternative, either harsh dictatorship for the third Greek bailout or deliberative authoritarianism in the case of Ireland, Portugal, etc., where yes, there was deliberation, but those leaders of those countries simply had to accept the imposition by the Troika. So that's the council. European Central Bank? Was it the hero saving the euro, or the ogre as an unaccountable in terms of demanding of austerity of all member states as a quid pro quo? The Commission, ayatollahs of austerity demanding rapid deficit reduction and cuts in welfare, deregulation of labor markets through the European semester in the first 2 years, or perhaps ministers of moderation, certainly in the later years, as it eases the rules with increasing flexibility, even though till 2015 it denied it in the discourse. And this is part of the reinterpretation of the rules by stealth. Parliament, talking shop, or potentially equal partner. At the very least, we can say that the EP, from almost no role at all, has become increasingly a forum for accountability in terms of investigations, hearings, and it is the go-to body for other institutional actors seeking to demonstrate their own accountability, in particular the ECB, but also the Commission. So that's throughput legitimacy, but I've also, in the book, it's not enough to just say, here are the governance procedures. What's the impact of this? So I look at policy effectiveness and performance, and then I also look at the politics. And so in terms of policy effectiveness and performance, major problems. Misframing of the crisis as a public debt issue as opposed to the real problem, which was private debt. Therefore, misdiagnosis of the crisis as a behavioral problem rather than the structure of the euro. We end up with wrong remedies, austerity and structural reform for all, and no solutions. No European Monetary Fund, no euro bonds. Yes, we got banking union, but we still don't have individual deposit insurance, unemployment insurance, etc. Although COVID-19 has produced some changes for some of this. The result, however, of the lack of policy effectiveness is that there was much slower Eurozone growth for all. Certainly there's a revealing contrast with the US. There are increases everywhere in terms of poverty, as well as unemployment, especially in Southern Europe, rising inequality everywhere. And problems also, in particular, these different varieties of capitalism and the way in which different growth models that were equally problematically affected, in particular in Southern Europe. So that's output, lack of legitimacy or problematic legitimacy. And what about input legitimacy for the politics? What we saw is a lack of citizen participation and very little elite political responsiveness. So we got what we can talk about, the economics of people feeling left behind, the socio-cultural worries about a loss of social status, and thus let's blame the immigrants. And of course, the political anger about the loss of control, take back control as the watchword, in particular in the UK with Brexit, but elsewhere as well. So what about in terms of COVID? The good news is that EU actors seem to have learned their lessons in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, it's true that the EU at first was very slow to start. It was inefficient procedurally. It looked like the Eurozone crisis déjà vu all over again. The Council was unaccountable. It fails to act as member states pursue their own policies. The ECB claimed it was not its mandate to deal with the spreads between German and Italian bonds. The European Parliament played no role. The Commission was nowhere. And on top of it, it looked like it was the migration crisis all over again as national borders go up everywhere. But this changed quickly. The member states, importantly, immediately throw out the Eurozone budgetary rules. Budget deficits and debts go straight up with massive infusions of money from the member states. The ECB, after that initial misstep, becomes a hero in the Eurozone without any ogre-like demands for austerity and structural reform. The Council is no dictatorship led by Germany, but rather it's a deliberative, mutually accountable deliberative body pushed by the Franco-German duo. The Commission, unlike in the Eurozone, is not the ayatollahs of austerity, but immediately ministers of moderation as they accommodate the member states, suspending budgetary criteria to allow unlimited government spending, suspending state aid rules, recommending that big multi-annual financial framework, lots of more money to spur growth, the whole resilience and recovery fund, all of that tremendously important, plus employment support through SURE, etc. So in short, the EU seems to have learned many of the legitimacy lessons of the Eurozone crisis, of course, with the exception of a few member states, the frugal four. But all this said, there's still some way to go. The populist anti-system party revolt that stems in part from citizen reactions to the Eurozone crisis is not over. The governing by rules and ruling by numbers of the Eurozone have only been suspended, not officially revoked, and the Eurozone still lacks many of the necessary instruments to ensure optimal performance. But I guess at the very least we can say the response to the COVID crisis reverses some of the worst legitimacy lapses of the Eurozone crisis. And at least in that way, it's a very good start. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Vivien. I give the floor immediately to Paul now to start the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Doro. Professor Schmidt, I very much enjoyed reading your Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy. It's an important and timely book, as it tells us the story of the Eurozone crisis and of the institutional reaction that it prompted. It allows us to look back and assess the successes and mistakes of the past decade. But more importantly, the book tackles the fundamental question of the legitimacy of EU action in the economic field and critically assesses the EU's crisis management in the light of your famous triptych of input, output, and throughput legitimacy. But for me, as a lawyer, the main added value of the book lies in the way it unravels the reinterpretation by stealth of the core rules that structure the economic and monetary union and the single currency as an economic and as a political project. So I think the book does a fantastic job in showing how the Eurozone crisis prompted a set of silent but fundamental transformation, which deeply changed the currency union and its founding paradigms. So I'd like to focus my intervention around two main comments. And the first one relates to the set of institutions that the book chooses to focus on. And your analysis essentially revolves around the four main EU institutions, namely, as you've just explained it, the Council, the ECB, the Commission, and the Parliament. And to a certain extent, this selection makes sense. I mean, those are the main components of the EU institutional system, and they proved, each in their own way, instrumental in the management of the Euro crisis. But as a lawyer specialized in the law of the economic and monetary union and in Eurozone governance, I was a bit surprised that an entire category of actors was somehow absent of that selection. And of course, that category is the category of courts, either national or European. So courts do appear here and there, but they do not form a fully fledged part of the assessment conducted in the book. So of course, I mean, by their very nature, courts are not directly part to the policymaking process, since they only intervene a posteriori to rule on the legality of the action favored by the political branches. But I found it nonetheless surprising that courts were somewhat left out of the picture. And the main reason for this is that, well, the crisis brought about an unprecedented level of judicialization of economic and monetary policy in Europe, both at the national and at the supranational level. So during the crisis, we saw that each and every major initiative taken by the EU was challenged before national or European courts, forcing the judicial branch to step in. Of course, this has to do with the fact that the euro was established as a constitutional currency, in the sense that it's, unlike many other major currencies around the world, it's a currency whose founding rules and principles are consecrated at the highest level possible in the hierarchy of norms, and for the EU, that is the EU treaties. So as a consequence, the political battles that the crisis prompted eventually ended up in a courtroom. So it seems to me that from a legitimacy perspective, this phenomenon of judicialization of Eurozone governance is a phenomenon hard to overlook. And it's all the more so that the Court of Justice played really an essential part in this process of reinterpretation by stealth that the book intends to analyze. So in several landmark rulings, the court very much accompanied, supported, and framed this reinterpretation process which was at play. So for example, in 2012, we had the famous Pringle ruling in which the Court of Justice validated the conclusion of the ESM treaty and consecrated a new interpretation of the no bailout clause. In a similar manner, we had first Goweiler and then the Weiss case in which the court validated the non-standard monetary policy of the ECB, confirming the extension of its mandate and greatly relaxing the prohibition of monetary financing. So in doing so, the Court of Justice very much contributed or exacerbated many of the legitimacy problems that the book identifies, whether it is excessive intergovernmentalism, parliamentary sidelining, the dominance of non-majoritarian institutions, secrecy, lack of transparency, insufficient accountability. But on the other hand, I mean, just as we've shown it for the Council, the ECB, the Commission, or the Parliament, each institution is a bit Janus-faced. And on the other hand, the other part of the story is that courts also try to act as catalysts for change, and thereby contributing to enhance the legitimacy of political action, especially via more throughput legitimacy and better procedural quality of decision-making. So courts have done so increasingly over the past few years. So for example, the Court of Justice has made very clear that the Commission and the ECB, when they act as Troika members, they remain fully bound by the legal obligations under the treaties, and they can be potentially found accountable, for example, for human rights breaches. More recently, we've had the PSPP ruling from the German Constitutional Court last May, and in that ruling, the German Constitutional Court called upon the ECB to better take into account the economic and the fiscal policy effects of its program, so as to ensure their better quality, their better proportionality, and by doing so, potentially enhancing the throughput legitimacy of ECB action. So the role of courts in the various phenomena that the book touches upon is certainly not to be downplayed, and I think it could have been engaged with more forcefully. The second comment that I would have, and it very much relates to your last set of remarks, and I would like to ask you more directly how your book, its main conclusions, and also the recommendations that you make in the last chapter, how this fits against the background of the current COVID-19 crisis and the recent initiatives taken at EU level to deal with the ongoing economic recession. So, to put it bluntly, how do you think that your book will outlive the COVID-19 crisis? Will it, and if so, how? And also maybe if you were given a chance to, which of your findings, which of your recommendations would you amend? And more particularly, because you've already somehow touched upon that question, I'd like to ask you about this process of reinterpretation by stealth that the book very much revolves around. Do you see this still ongoing at the moment? Are EU institutions more openly admitting that they are changing the founding paradigms of the euro, or are they not? To me, my impression is that we are still in this kind of constructive ambivalence, this kind of institutional hypocrisy, in the sense that on the one hand, well, we see that certain taboos are being broken. We see that states manage to solve some of their existential disagreements about joint debt, about greater financial solidarity, about the virtues of public investments and neo-Keynesian policies. So Germany, for example, is no longer that hobbled hegemon that you describe. Germany managed to go beyond its historical reluctances towards greater solidarity and risk sharing. So potentially the recent initiative, starting with the recovery plan, might take us to a new stage in the integration process. But on the other hand, we also see that if this is an ongoing revolution, it remains a somewhat silent one, in the sense that the official narrative is that, well, rules have been put on hold, and nothing that is currently being done questions the fundamental structures of the EU and of the Eurozone. So the ongoing initiatives are only justified by the exceptionality of the situation and the magnitude of the shock that hit Europe. So this, to my opinion, indicates that the EU somewhat perpetuates this process of reinterpretation by stealth, under which constitutional transformation is brought about in a non-transparent and non-assumed manner. This also assumes that many of the structural legitimacy deficiencies identified in the book are likely to survive the COVID-19 crisis. So whether it is parliamentary sidelining, technocratic and executive dominance, or excessive centralization, very much looks like the errors of the Eurozone crisis are about to be replicated, and that your assessment will remain, at least to a large extent, very much relevant for the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. This was very, very up to the point. Sebastian, floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Doro. And let me also say, first of all, that for me, it's also a great pleasure and honor to discuss this book as someone who, like quite a few of us, grew up reading Vivian Schmidt's work, perhaps not during childhood, but at least during graduate studies. And also as someone who, perhaps equally like quite a few of us in political economy, keeps coming back to many of her key concepts, not least in Put Output Legitimacy, simply because they seem to work so well across quite a few different and actually many different cases. So I wholeheartedly, first of all, recommend reading the book to both newcomers and veterans of Vivian Schmidt's work, because it nicely brings together some of these greatest hits and adds brand new ideas and fresh material. Now I could stop my comment right there. However, I'm asked to not just offer praise for the book, but also to try and critique it, which I will try, even if it's not that easy at all. There are a few things one could comment on, or at least inquire about, but I need to be selective, of course, and we also try to discuss beforehand to avoid too much overlap in our comments. And so my intervention naturally focuses on those aspects of the book that intersect most with my own research interests, or perhaps biases, which are very much related to the role of the European Central Bank, which I also happen to believe turned out to be the most crucial and central actor in the crisis. And to some extent also the depiction and the role of the European Parliament and the interplay between those two. And as a true ECB and European Parliament nerd, of course, I just listened to Professor Schmidt's intervention today at the European Parliament on the ECB. So my comments essentially boil down to seeing more continuity before and after the crisis than meets the eye and then is perhaps acknowledged in the book. If we look at the ECB in particular, although this quite probably also holds for other cases discussed in different chapters, then in general, I'd be very much on board with the depiction of it having been either a hero or ogre of the crisis. But the book quite explicitly suggests two competing narratives of the ECB, namely that it went from ogre or villain to hero over time, especially from Jean-Claude Trichet to Mario Draghi, though not exactly from Trichet to Draghi, or that it was a villain all along. And I couldn't help thinking that it would be equally or perhaps even more plausible to consider a third avenue, namely that the ECB has always been both already before the crisis, and that indeed it could hardly be any other way. What do I mean by that? So ever since the introduction of the euro, the crucial and obvious problem that the ECB has faced is that it needs to devise and conduct this single monetary policy for a pretty diverse union of member states, as we all know. And in an ideal world, this would mean one size fits all, but in terms of monetary policy, but as suggested in the book and elsewhere, this more often than not turned out to be one size fits none. Or perhaps actually one size fits some, and fits some more than others, as Matthias Vermeilen and others have suggested quite convincingly. Now, my conjecture in all of this would be that the ECB didn't move away from one size fits none, unlike the book suggests, because this is an unresolved and perhaps even unresolvable feature of the union. And so whatever it does, including whatever it takes, will mean that monetary policy is always, or at least is always seen as, too tight for some and too loose for others. So in other words, the ECB is bound to remain both hero and ogre by design, quite importantly, and not so much maybe by choice. And so it's perhaps a bit less about its preferences or ideas or whatever we deem to be the source of its agency, and is something much more structural than perhaps acknowledged here. And I guess one could push that line of argument even further and make it not merely a positive, but actually a normative claim maybe, insofar as if the ECB always does too little in the eyes of some and too much in the eyes of others, then perhaps on average it gets things just about right, instead of facing this perpetual legitimacy crisis. But that's, I acknowledge, very much something to be discussed. And I just put that out there for discussion. Now, just a couple of more minor comments, but along similar lines. I would also see continuity rather than shifts in the expert epistemic communities of the ECB, which the book defines as other central bankers, financial market participants, think tanks, which I would suggest are much the same before and after the crisis, and perhaps hardly explain shifting positions of the ECB like QE. And perhaps the same goes not just for these expert accountability forums, as the book calls them succinctly, but also for some of the political accountability forums, which then brings us to the European Parliament and the Council. Now, of course, the monetary dialogue with the European Parliament that you spoke about today at the European Parliament is surely the main locus of accountability for the ECB and other actors, but it's not the only one. And there are, of course, in the case of the ECB, not least annual reports to the entire Parliament, which the book addresses, but also to the Council, quite importantly, which could have been acknowledged. And even more importantly, the ECB president has always been present at council meetings of finance ministers to coordinate, or at the very least to lecture, let's say, already before the crisis. While during the crisis, also Trichet interacted with heads of states in the council. And after the crisis, and here I just echo what Paul just said, one would very much be tempted to add to this whole orchestra of accountability the Court of Justice of the European Union, which has arguably come to provide this ex post legitimation for ECB actions as well. So I'd also be equally interested to hear more about that, and perhaps why it doesn't feature maybe even a chapter or so of the book. Anyhow, I don't want to dwell on in too much detail about this. So my final point or question really is of a more methodological nature, and it's also very much out of curiosity. And it's whether one couldn't do even more, and even more empirically, to uncover different actors' discourse, and especially over time. So in terms of communicative discourse, all sorts of quantitative text analysis tools come to mind. Some are used in the chapter that was previously also a West European politics article. But of course, there's more out there in terms of tools, and I'd be happy to brainstorm in terms of what could be applied. And on the coordinative side, in terms of coordinative discourse, of course, one could think of more interviews or so with relevant stakeholders, many of which are now retired after the crisis and are happy, or at least happier to speak, maybe, at least from my own recent experience. But maybe that's also a task for us readers in that sense, as follow-up researchers. So, and I think due to the book, we are now very well equipped due to the conceptual groundwork laid in the book. And so I will just end by saying thank you very much for writing it.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I'm happy to that you lay out a new research agenda for generations of scholars to come. Brigid, you have the floor.
Thank you, Doro, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel this evening. It's a great pleasure. It's a particular pleasure because I've heard and read versions of parts of this book over many years. I think, in fact, one of the first papers was delivered at a workshop we did on the crisis way back in 2014. So it's wonderful to see the book in print and to see all of Vivian's arguments, all of the themes brought together through with the lens of legitimacy. I also recommend this book because of its richness. There's nothing parsimonious in the search for explanation and understanding. Vivian ranges very widely theoretically and empirically. And I think that very richness means that I found myself reading a sentence and then going back and reading it again. So I commend the richness. I also think that it bears the hallmarks of Vivian's theoretical contributions, the discursive institutionalism and the throughput. And clearly Vivian's take on the Euro crisis and the challenge of legitimacy is very much one of ineffective policies, volatile politics, reordering the rules by stealth, and basically arguing that the crisis response was really wrong. It is highly critical of the EU's response to the Eurozone crisis. And I think that critique stands up. But perhaps, and in terms of the argument in the book, perhaps not enough attention is paid to the enormity of what the system was facing in 2009, 10, 11, and 12. I'm not sure that the book really lays out just how serious a crisis this was. And I say this for a number of reasons. Firstly, this was an incomplete constitutional currency, as Paul said. It was an incomplete regime in terms of economic and monetary union. It was a new currency that was tested for the first time, not by a normal downturn in the business cycle, but by a major recession, by the greatest recession since the 1930s, the Great Depression. So this was an extraordinary test of this incomplete regime and a new currency. Secondly, I would argue that the Eurozone actors in 2008 had no idea, and I mean no idea, about what might happen. In 2008, there was a Commission communication on the 10 years of the Euro. The Euro has been a resounding success. Europe has shown itself resilient to adverse external factors. There was a special issue of the European economy where European economists did identify the problems. I mean, we know the structural problems of the Eurozone from the beginning, but no one knew the storm that was coming. So I would argue that the political actors really did not know and were not prepared for what was originally thought as a problem of the Anglo-American capitalist system and not something that was going to come very close to blowing the Eurozone apart. So I'm not sure that the book does justice to the enormity of the challenge that the political actors were facing in the institutions. The second reason why I think that this was particularly intractable for the Eurozone is in 2012, I was interviewing in the German finance ministerium, and I was very struck by something a senior civil servant said. He said, "This is a who pays crisis." And a who pays crisis inevitably is distributive. And as we know, distributive crises are extremely difficult. So it was a who pays in who was going to pay public or private for the banking crisis. It was a who pays in terms of who would pay the adjustment costs, and we know the debtors did. And of course, it was a who pays in terms of who was prepared to risk. But I was very struck by the who pays. So I would say that the nature of the crisis and the nature of the Eurozone meant that this was very singular as a crisis. You mentioned the US, Vivian, that the US was not faced with anything like the same economic downturn, but the US had much more instruments available to it to deal with the crisis early on. The third thing I would say is that this was also a crisis that revealed power in the EU, and I think your book brings that out very clearly. But power and coercion in monetary systems, the power of monetary power, it tends to, when can it be used? It's used when there's, and here I'm using Kirchner, his ideas about currency and coercion. It's used when there's asymmetry of power, and there clearly was the debtor-creditor. It's used when there's dependence and vulnerability. And again, the creditor-debtor was a story of dependence and vulnerability. But he also argues that it's particularly when the fear of expulsion that accentuates dependency and vulnerability. So that core cleavage is the cleavage of the euro crisis. And Kirchner argues that debtor states are entrapped when they fear expulsion. And I think your chapters bring that out, the entrapment of the debtor states. But I'm going to argue, and I would like your thoughts on, that it wasn't just the debtor states that were entrapped, but the creditor states were also entrapped. And they were entrapped in an incomplete and dysfunctional currency regime. Germany ended up with the Eurozone that it did not want. It wanted, and its preference was at Maastricht, for a greater Denmark zone. And all of the inclusion of the convergence criteria was to make sure it would be a greater Denmark zone and not a large Eurozone. And they didn't get the Eurozone that they wanted or that they preferred. So you have this problem of a dual entrapment. And the dual entrapment was then accentuated by what you describe as the split level legitimacy. Because a German government, and you describe them as the hegemon, but the German government could not have got the kinds of policy solutions that you would argue for and that would have helped, such as mutualization. It would not have been possible, either legally or in parliamentary terms, to get that through the German political system. And so that split legitimacy and that dual entrapment of the creditors and debtors. But of course, the creditors and debtors were inaction was not an option, because the currency was in trouble and contagion was about to get out of control. And so here, where did the dynamic come to push these actors towards developing the toolkit, reinventing the rules? It was the market. It was the fact that for political actors, financial crises are extremely dangerous. They're not normal economic crises. If your banking system goes down, your society and your economy seizes. So I think that there was, that panic, that panic that is generated by the fear and panic, the shadow of the markets, was very graphically displayed through this crisis with those spreads. Night by night, we saw the spreads, and night by night, we saw the debt levels. So again, the response of the institutions, the market pressures were really very strong. And I think it was what pushed the actors to respond in the way they did over time. And of course, the ECB, and I agree with Sebastian when he said the ECB was the institution, it could have reacted much more quickly. But if you remember and you show the orchestration between the Council and the ECB and Draghi, and I think here Monti probably played a very important role. So I'd like your sense of how that dual entrapment of the creditors and debtors, how that impacted on the way in which the response was emerged. Now, when it comes to efficiency or effectiveness and efficacy, what were the key goals of the creditors? The key goals of the creditors were to maintain financial stability and to ensure the euro survived. And they achieved both of those. But of course, it was achieved at treating the program countries as problems to be dealt with rather than partners in a currency union. But the key goals of the key actors during this crisis have been met. They did enough to save the euro for now, and in my view, will do enough if possible. I mean, in other words, unless it's the kind of crisis that they can't solve collectively, they will do enough the next time as well. So, and then one final thought, and that is the timing and the framing. If Ireland and not Greece had been the first country in trouble, would the euro crisis have played out differently? Because in Ireland, it was the banking crisis, whereas in Greece it was a debt problem. So I wonder also, was there a timing in terms of the ordering of the program countries, and how impactful that was on the way in which the institutions responded to the crisis. But great book, and it's such a rich book that we will be discussing it for many years to come. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Brigid. So you have a rich menu from which you can feast, Vivien, in your answers. Just take your time, pick the things that you would really want to address, and go ahead, please.
Thanks. These are fantastic comments, and it just shows that there's so much more to be written about the Eurozone crisis, and from so many different perspectives. And mine really was trying to focus in on legitimacy and trying to think about how the actors themselves saw what they were doing. So legitimacy from many different perspectives, not only different kinds of legitimacy in terms of input, output, throughput, but also the different perspectives one can have on legitimacy, meaning the actors themselves, as well as what we experts say, and of course, how the public sees them. And what I was trying to do was sort of juggle with many different balls in the air, trying to, so just sort of very quickly, some comments in order to make sure that there's time for others to ask questions. So I'll start in order of comments. So Paul, thank you so much. Wonderful exposition of what I would and should have done in yet another chapter, but I can tell you that I found myself at the end of the first draft, which was supposed to be the last draft and was at least 4 years overdue. I found myself with 175,000 words, and had initially contracted for maybe 110, I went back to my editor at Oxford and we got it to 125, which ended up being 138,000. But it meant that there were a whole range of issues that I couldn't get to. And certainly the legal issues were there. I was aware of them. And I did try to put them in inappropriate places so they come up, but certainly not enough. But that just leaves room for you and other legal experts to do a lot better than I did in terms of dealing with the judicialization. I mean, but at the same time, what I should say is what I find fascinating is that is the kind of informal governance, and sort of it's that the courts come in and actually say, yes, the actors did what the actors did was fine each time. So legitimizing the procedural changes that occurred. And so my focus was less on, okay, how do the courts legitimize it and let them go on with it, but actually, how did they do that? How did they actually convince one another? So it really is about ideas and discourse all the way through. And there simply wasn't room to bring in, fully and appropriately the judicial side. But you gave a beautiful account of exactly that. So yes, we need more, but I leave it to you actually on that. But sort of your next question was how the book's recommendations fit in terms of COVID. And can the book outlive the COVID-19 crisis? And I have to admit that as the COVID crisis hit and the book was going off, to be printed, there's nothing I could do, or very little, but I realized just, as I hit the button last time for the proofs, I realized, oh my God, my first sentence in the preface is, the Eurozone crisis is arguably the worst crisis the EU has suffered, in the past decade or ever. And I thought, uh-oh, I managed to change that first paragraph to, with the exception of the Eurozone, of the COVID-19 crisis, the Eurozone was the worst crisis, etc. And lessons are to be learned from this. But, I couldn't put those lessons in at the end, and I sort of just sent it off, and with a sigh thought, okay, well, that's instant history now. But actually, I sent it off in March, and we didn't know what was coming. And in fact, what's nice about that, and that responds to a later question, it's your question, which of my recommendations would I amend and which are still valid? And actually, surprisingly enough, they're all still valid. The recommendations are, and some of them have been fulfilled. I basically, one of the things I said is get rid of those rules, governing by rules and ruling by numbers, or at least use them as guidelines. And what you see in the discussion of reforms, those rules are now, the rules and numbers are suspended. It's quite clear that those numerical targets make no sense. 60% debt at a moment when most countries will be at 120, 30, 50, 150 or whatever percent debt. That's going to be, that's going to be rise. Deficits are going to remain very high for a very long time. There are suggestions of reform. Olivier Bras has one, and he's talking about standards. Exactly the kind of thing that I was suggesting in terms of, at most, talk about the rules as guidelines, but even that. And I also recommended major investment, shifting the focus. All of that is now happening, and started with the Resilience and Recovery Fund, a shift to green bonds. That's for the ECB in the ECB chapter. It's not a shift yet, but it's a recognition that there needs to be the green transition, the digital transformation, and the Resilience and Recovery Fund are essentially there for that, plus social issues, addressing inequality. So in a way, I see COVID-19 as a kind of step change, perhaps even a paradigm change when we're talking about the economics. And I say that having heard Paolo Gentiloni talk about having talked to Wolfgang Schäuble, German finance minister, the hero of the Schwarze Null and all of that, Black Zero, who said, oh, we're not going to go back on this. Yes, this is fine. This is what we need to do. And it's sort of a massive shift. So given that I do discursive institutionalism, this is an ideational shift. This is tremendously important. So Brigid, just on the issue of being trapped, it's not, they're trapped in all sorts of ways. For Paul, it's the legal rules. And for Sebastian, it's the structure of the euro. For you, it's all of this and the constitutionalization, all of that. But on top of that, trapped in ideas. No one could see beyond, except some economists outside, many economists actually outside. But for those actors, they couldn't see beyond. Well, I'll get back to that in a minute. In any case, essentially, just to finish my comments for Paul, is that I think my recommendations are all there, not just on the kind of output recommendations for better performance, policies in terms of the fund, but also on shifting the way in which the rules are dealt with. I can say more on this later, but also in terms of my recommendations on input legitimacy, getting rid of the unanimity rule, moving to supermajorities, bringing the European Parliament in more, even national parliaments. Really, there needs to be much more democratization, including shifting the way in which the European semester works from a seemingly top-down, it's not entirely that, but to shift it, to flip it to bottom-up. And in some ways, these national resilience and recovery plans are doing exactly that. It is now the member states saying, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we see what needs to be done. This is really industrial policy from the bottom up, with the EU providing money. That's exactly the sort of recommendation I was making in order to democratize the process. I mean, there's more to that, but that's it. Okay, so for Sebastian, thank you so much. I mean, the ECB, a crucial actor, and I was very ambivalent, and part of, and for all of this, part of the reason I went to Janus Faced, and this is for Brigid as well, is because I recognized that this was such a massive crisis, and I did try to talk about in various places in the book about the tremendous knowing what to do, and so in one iteration of these various chapters, I left it so open that I had one person read it and say, no, Vivian, you've got to make a decision here. Are they the hero or are they the ogre? Are they ayatollahs of austerity or ministers of moderation? And so I ended up saying, okay, I will say something. And yet it's very hard to, because I do see, and so Brigid, you're absolutely right, I do see the bind that they were in. And how do we do? So I tried to leave it as open-ended as possible and allow you, the reader, to try to decide where you would where you would be on this. Even though I end up saying in the concluding paragraph or so, here's where I stand. And I think for the Commission, we see incremental change from ayatollahs of austerity to ministers of moderation. For the ECB, Sebastian, I think you're right. They remain both, just because of the construction of the Eurozone, except that ogre, more specifically see them as ogre with regard to the quid pro quo that they were using. Oh, we're going to do some increasing monetary transactions, OMT and all the rest. Well, no, okay. We don't dare, we're afraid of Northern Europe. Therefore, and the legal, Paul, therefore, we're going to have the quid pro quo. We will do this, but financial consolidation for those countries that are going to take the program, money, if they do. And then, of course, Italy and Spain didn't have to do it with the MTO. And then quantitative easing, exactly. So all of that, I think, is important to see. Yeah, and on the epistemic communities and think tanks, there's a story that still needs to be told. I was very tentative in terms of saying, my question is, how did we go from a situation in which the Bundesbank had a, you know, a blocking coalition, a majority coalition that essentially said to the ECB, you know, this is what you've got to do. And it is a distributional crisis, as Brigid was saying. It is creditor versus debtor. How do we go from a situation where it seems obvious that nothing's going to change and we're in old liberal irreality forever to over and over again? And for me, the only way that can happen, how do you convince the other members of the, you know, the governing body? How do you change their minds? It's got to be opening up to a larger epistemic community, you know, and bringing in the research from the experts, the think tanks, other economic ideas. You know, you can still be, you know, and it seems to me that that's the way, that the kinds of shift in ideas that you get in the ECB and the incremental change over time has to be that they were working very hard to convince members of the governing board that they needed to shift the policy. And here's how to do it. And I think that's, you know, that's sort of the technical accountability forums, as I used the term in the European Parliament, is something that no one thinks about with accountability. But for central bankers, as, you know, as bankers, as financial experts, and all the people in that body, they talk to one another. It's their prestige, their professional, you know, ethos that is in question. And that's also about accountability. And of course, the ECB was out of step, way out of step initially. And it slowly but surely comes closer and closer to doing what it needed to do right from the beginning, but at least it gets there with QE by 2015. And there's still problems with it. How do we explain it? And that's why I think it's really important to think about the epistemic communities. But, you know, I don't have that information. What you need is someone deeply embedded, as in the Iraq War for the journalists, deeply embedded in the ECB to be able to make that kind of argument. But I'd love to see research on that. And I, you know, there are just limits to how much I could do. And I was kind of deeply embedded briefly in the Directorate General of Economics and Finance in the Commission when they asked me to apply for a part-time research fellowship to talk to them about legitimacy. And I applied and I was accepted, which may be a question about legitimacy, but anyway, we won't talk about that. So I was very happy to be there. And I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned is that that it's, you know, I was looking at from the outside, and I saw them, just as everyone else did, as ayatollahs of austerity. The minute I started talking to them, people inside, what you got was a sense that, wait a minute, the rules were changing. They were reinterpreting them, and not happy that they were seen as ayatollahs either. But they couldn't say it because they're a different institution from the ECB. The ECB has autonomy. It can reinterpret its mandate kind of in plain view by saying, this is in my mandate, even though it goes from a very narrow view to a very, very expansive view. This is my mandate, this is my mandate. That's a form of stealthiness, or reinterpreting the rules by stealth, but it's different from the commission, which had to say, hey, harsh austerity and structural reform, that's Olli Rent saying it over and over again. So we all believed it, even as his commission was, you know, engaging in derogating the rules for France and Italy, allowing Spain to recalculate the numbers, all of that. But, you know, so that was really the disconnect. And this is why it's really important to look not just at what they say, but at what they do, see how they match up, which is also an important thing for legitimacy. So fascinating to be inside, deeply embedded, to get a better understanding of what was going on. And finally now, for Brigid, but this also speaks to the other questions. You know, you're absolutely right. All of that. You have brilliantly described what was going on, the enormity of the task, and the extraordinary nature of the crisis, and people's lack of preparedness. This is about a lack of ideas. And that's something, this is something that's not in the book, but I've recently started thinking about, and it's going to be in a debate section for the Journal of European Public Policy. It was a little paragraph in the introduction about what happens between political actors, technical actors in a fast-burning and a slow-burning crisis. And it's something I thought about briefly and then just left. And what brought it back to mind is that when I gave a talk on the book for DG ECFIN in September, Marco Butti, who was earlier Director General of DG ECFIN and is now head of cabinet for Paolo Gentiloni, Commissioner of the Economy, he brought this up and said, now Vivian said some really interesting things. And so I thought, well, if he thinks that's interesting, then maybe I better go back and look at this, which was just, left there. And so in this short debate piece, I try to talk about timing and, fast versus slow burning crisis and what political actors do and technical actors do. And the logic is that in a fast burning crisis, political actors have to act and they have to ask fast. And what they do is they look around for ideas and they ask the technical actors, what are your ideas? In this kind of unprecedented crisis, the technical actor had no ideas at all, other than to say, let's double down on the rules. The Commission had been working on the European semester for 10 years, never got it. Brilliant, it gets that. Austerity and structural reform, why not? Doubling down on the rules simply was easier to do, and that's what happened. But then when the crisis slows, the political actors, okay, crisis over, let's get on to other issues or everyday politics. But the technical actors have time to learn, have time to reflect, and they also have to deal with the aftermath. And here what we saw is the technical actors, whether the ECB or the Commission, saying, what are we going to do? This doesn't work. Output legitimacy is a serious problem, and even procedural. And what you saw is slowly but surely, this is the incremental change, the reinterpretation of the rules that they engaged in because they knew it wasn't working. They also worked on big ideas, but no political actor was going to get involved with that. They don't need to. They're not interested until COVID-19 crisis happens. And then another fast-burning crisis, political actors there are saying, we have to do, what do we do? And this time around, the technical actors have ideas. And they say, we've got the answer for you. Here's what you do. The Commission actually does it itself. Sure, it's been working on unemployment insurance forever. It does that. It says we have to address a whole range of issues. It comes up, it's been wanting more money for investment for a long time. It's been working on that. It ups the ante then on the Franco-German duo's 500 billion recommendation. So here we should say the French are working on new ideas as well. It's not just EU level technical actors, it's also the national and political actors have to be ready and interested. But what we see in the COVID-19 crisis is here's a crisis where where the technical actors have been thinking for a long time. What do we do? How do we resolve it? And I think that's my explanation for partially why it was possible for this kind of quick response. Yes, there were 2 months of not, and yes, the Frugal Four, continued to say we love the old ideas, not the new ideas. But in this case, what you saw was a great leap forward. What I see is a paradigmatic shift. And as I say that, I can hear everyone say, wait a minute, come on now, let's be a little cynical. Can we really believe that this is going to continue? And there's always the danger, just as we saw in 2008, 2009, when we all saw that this was the next neo-Keynesian moment and the shift in paradigm, and then it goes back to, same old resilience of neoliberal and ordo-liberal ideas, as my 2013 book that I talked about. However, I think I'm hopeful that this time is different. Among other things, the taboos have been broken in terms of EU-level debt. Yes, it's a temporary fund, but from everything I see and what people say is it will become there will be a permanent fund just so long as it actually works, you know, as everyone does their job right in terms of spending the money in a way that will promote growth, et cetera. The danger is 2 or 3 years down the road, the austerity will be back, resilience of, you know, saying debt is bad. And I think that's where, you know, ideas and discourse come in. Everyone, all of us, everyone else has to say, this is not debt. This is not the kind of debt you're thinking. This is investment. This is investment in the future. And the only way to grow out of any kind of debt is through investment and growth in the economy. And we also need to fight populism. And that's the only way as well. That's it.
Okay, thanks a lot. I mean, just to offer my alternative hypothesis to a paradigm shift, Germany lost Britain, has to ally with France, and owns the Commission. And it left the frugal five, right? So the biggest frugal power in the EU basically left. And then you have the small countries fighting for this, but of course that's a very different constellation. That's my 5 cents on the COVID crisis. It has nothing to do with your book. I want to ask whether anyone in the audience has any questions. We have a couple of minutes left for questions. Please, if you want to ask, raise your blue hands. Yes, I see Robin. And you can, I don't see all of you. So if you are on a, yeah, you are there. Okay, Robin, so please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the presentation of the book. It certainly sounds very exciting, and for all the wonderful comments as well after that. Yeah, my question relates to, I mean, we've been focusing quite a lot on basically the extent to which the EMU's framework is changing and the EMU's legitimacy is changing in crisis. And I find it, you know, a very interesting issue, but I look personally at the impact of the EMU on welfare state recalibration over the medium to long run. And I'm wondering about whether we are not missing one part of the story, which is one that already, I mean, the respondents already kind of hinted at, is basically the elective affinities that we have between the national institutional frameworks or institutional arrangements, so maybe growth models, maybe industrial welfare state regimes, and the EMU's framework. But that's also over the long run. So basically not only in crisis times when a shock hits and whether or not we have the right instruments to respond to them at the EU level in a way that is not too asymmetric, but also by design, the EMU's design and the extent to which it should be amended. So basically coming back a bit to the question of that Paul raised, what are we doing in that space? And what do you think? Do you see some hope for it to evolve in that space as well? Or are basically some countries trapped and kind of doomed to kept being trapped by this framework? Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other hand. It's your last chance. Okay, then Vivian, the final words are yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robin, for that. And I should say that in the output legitimacy chapter, which is a very long chapter, I end up focusing on the impact on the welfare state and varieties of capitalism, growth models, and all of those problems. And I should say that when I started the book, I started in output legitimacy was at the beginning, then it was input legitimacy, and then throughput legitimacy. And then when I had to cut, you know, what I thought were 75,000 words, I actually flipped it and put throughput at the beginning, which was actually appropriate. I should have had that all along, but, you know, who knows when you start. And it was also the case that so many people had been writing about the output legitimacy, by which I mean political economy, that I no longer needed to tell the story at such length or at the beginning. So I ended up focusing on the political economy at the end, and at the very end of that chapter, I then talk about the impact of EMU on different growth models and welfare states. And of course, it's a tragic story. There you see massive divergence. You see, you know, deficit versus surplus versus deficit countries. You see, you know, I sort of do the macroeconomic picture, but then I look in at what happened in the welfare states. And what you can see is that, in particular in Southern Europe, but actually also Ireland, etc., these reform programs, whether formal conditionality or informal conditionality for Spain and Italy, were tremendously problematic for these countries. For their welfare states, they had only just gotten to where other Northern European countries and France had been for quite a while. But there's in a way, the discourse and the way in which it was framed, and that gets back to Brigid's question, was it became the problem for Southern Europe is the welfare state, overspending, wages too high, et cetera, which was bullshit. But that's and that is, as Brigid asked about timing, that's the problem of timing. Everything was read off Greece, not off Ireland or even Spain, both countries of which actually had low debt and low deficit going into the crisis. And it was banking crises. It was, private debt, not public. But because it was read off Greece, it became a focus on Southern European socioeconomic models. These have to be reformed. They need massive structural reform. Oh, and they've overspent, so austerity. And that was, a disaster for these countries in all sorts of ways. But in particular, if we then, fast forward to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, these are the countries then are hit, and this is sort of who knows who's going to be hit, but they're hit massively and they cannot respond. There's a reason why you have so many deaths, and it has to do with underfunding of hospitals and medical care for years, and a whole range of things. And yes, okay, Lombardy's good, but it's still highly problematic. And I just was on a thesis defense at Sciences Po in Paris. Tiago Moreira Ramalho, who has a wonderful thesis on dissertation on essentially the kind of discourse about Southern European countries and the welfare state, and that the whole problem was a discourse of it's the problem of the Southern European welfare state. And so cut, they're spending too much. And the irony, the tragedy is that they were told the way you have to reform in order to become more export oriented like Germany. But then how does that go along with crush the unions? I mean, the beauty of the export-oriented model is the kind of corporatism, the close relationship, the highly organized labor management relations on wage bargaining, and this is crushed in Southern Europe, as well as Ireland, for that matter. So that there's a complete disconnect. And of course, the problem then is that it also didn't fit with the growth models of these countries, which, I mean, I don't entirely buy the growth model theory where it's consumption oriented versus export oriented, because if you look at Italy, it's a mix, and Northern Italy is certainly highly export oriented. But what you can say is that these growth models and varieties of capitalism are very different. I mean, another piece of that, and that's in my own other work on state-influenced market economies, Southern Europe, as well as France, are basically state-influenced market economies. You need the state to invest because, for whatever reason, the private sector isn't doing that. That's different from Northern Europe. It's different from liberal market economies as well. And of course, the whole focus was on limiting state involvement in these reforms. What's interesting in COVID, of course, is the state is back in. And that's tremendously important. The state is back in to engage in industrial policies and to try to promote growth again. So what we hope, and so this is my final word, what we can hope is that this vast amount of money that is coming in, primarily actually for Southern European countries as well as Central and Eastern Europe, is that not only does this start fixing the inequality issues, because there's money for social investment, as well, but that it also fixes the sort of the variety of capitalism issue. The state is back in, invest in a way that was not possible before. I think the sort of the worst kind of discourse, even after things get better, was that those, and we heard it over and over again, those countries without fiscal space, of course, can't invest, and those with fiscal space, and couldn't invest. Those with fiscal space, we were told, should invest, but of course they didn't. And the result is Europe as a whole is in much worse shape than it was 10 years ago before the crisis, also because there's been minimal investment, not the kind of investment you need. So in a way, this was a halcyon moment, a fortuitous, wonderful moment for the EU. It got all these countries, as Brigid would say, out of the trap that they were in, and finally saying, okay, yes, we want to invest. We need to invest. We can invest. We've broken with the orthodoxies of the past, and now we're focused on the green transition, digital transformation, all of that, and attacking inequality and poverty. Because otherwise, rise of populism is going to continue, and we'll be in deep trouble in any case.
So I look forward to the next book, which will draw the lessons from the COVID crisis and whether all this paradigm shift really comes through. Thank you very much, everyone on the panel. Vivian, thank you very much. For all of you in the audience, you understand, go out, read the book. There is a lot in there. And I look forward, because you also mentioned partly already during the talk some of the processes of the book writing itself. So for the Max Weber Fellows who are interested, tomorrow Vivian will give a behind the scene kind of talk, workshop, talk type of thing about, what does it take actually to write such a book, and what are the pitfalls and what are the things that is happening. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a very nice evening.
And thank you all. Thanks to my discussants. Fantastic comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great moderation. Bye-bye.